Welcome to the Global Risk Podcast by Solace Global. In this edition of Regional Flashpoints, we look at two developments shaping the current global risk environment. We begin with the wider impact of the conflict involving Iran, where second-order effects are increasingly being felt well beyond the Middle East. Then we turn to Latin America, where a new phase in US-Ecuador cooperation signals a shift in how cartel activity is being targeted. To unpack both developments and what they could mean going forward, here's our intelligence analyst, Manfredi Pozzoli.
Since the outbreak of the conflict between the US and Israel on one side and Iran on the other on the 28th of February 2026, there has been an important spike in what we might call second-order effects. These include terrorism, civil unrest, and hybrid warfare targeting Western assets and nationals across Western Europe and North America. Protests in support of the Iranian regime and against Western intervention in Iran have been recorded not only in Western Europe and North America, but also in other countries outside of the West. In some cases, these protests have turned violent. For example, protests in Karachi have resulted in dozens of casualties after protesters tried to storm the US consulate. Protests pose a direct threat to attendees as well as Western nationals and assets in several countries. As the conflict continues, protests are likely to expand, including beyond large urban centers. A second important threat that arises from the conflict is that of hybrid warfare. Iran, like Russia, has utilized hybrid warfare methods to destabilize countries that it considers its adversaries. Since the outbreak of conflict in Iran, we have seen an important spike in attacks, including arson attacks and sabotage attacks, targeting assets associated with the US or with Jewish communities in Europe and North America. These included, for example, several firebombing attacks targeting synagogues in northwestern Europe. Some of these attacks have been claimed by groups that have seemingly appeared out of thin air, such as the Islamic movement of the Companions of the Right, which in many ways adopt a similar aesthetic code to that of Hezbollah and other Shia groups associated or aligned with Iran. There's a realistic possibility that these groups are operating with a hybrid warfare structure on behalf of the Islamic Republic of Iran. Finally, the last important threat is that of terrorism. And since the outbreak of the conflict, we've seen several cases of lone wolves. These are self-radicalized individuals targeting Jewish communities, places associated with the US or assets associated with US and Western nationals across Western Europe and North America. Some important cases include the ISIS-inspired attack at the University of Virginia and also an attack in Michigan. These attacks are often uncoordinated. They're not organized hierarchically by terrorist groups. However, they are inspired by terrorist groups. What we've seen in the past few years is that terrorist groups that operate worldwide, like the Islamic State, have increasingly called on supporters to carry out these so-called inspired attacks. Although not directly related to the conflict, a few weeks before the conflict started, the Islamic State, quote-unquote, Central Command, made their first public statement since 2024. In these statements, they outright called on supporters to stage lone wolf attacks across Europe and North America. It's highly likely that ISIS, although ideologically opposed to the Iranian regime, has taken advantage of the outbreak of war to increase its attack preparation and operations across the West.
While the impact of the Iran conflict is being felt across multiple regions, developments in Latin America are also pointing to a shift in the security landscape.
On the 5th of March 2026, the US and Ecuadorian officials announced their first joint operation inland. This is an operation targeting the Commandos of the Frontier, a Colombian armed group that broke off from the Revolutionary Armed Forces in Colombia after 2016. And the attack happened on the border between Colombia and Ecuador. Now, this operation is notable because it is the first joint operation carried inland by the US with a Latin American partner against cartels since the beginning of the Trump administration. The US, of course, has been carrying out targeted strikes on vessels the US officials argue are being used by cartel members to smuggle narcotics, although this has generated important international protest. At the same time as the raid, US officials announced the creation of an anti-cartel alliance known as the Shield of the Americas. It includes 13 countries across Latin America. Many of these countries are ruled by recently elected right-wing governments that have pledged to implement the so-called mano dura or iron fist model to their warfare against the cartels. This model was inspired by El Salvador, which trialed it and also made it popular across Latin America. This alliance has some important vulnerabilities. Most notably, it doesn't include Colombia, Brazil, and Mexico, which are three of the key players in the fight against the cartels in that region. However, it is notable that the operation was launched at the same time as the announcement of the alliance, and it likely indicates that the US will intensify inland operations against the cartels in the near future.
That concludes this episode of Regional Flashpoints on the Global Risk podcast. These updates form part of our Global Intelligence subscription, which includes weekly reports, in-depth briefings, and live Q&A sessions with our experts. To learn more, visit solisglobal.com. Thank you for listening.